Many of us sew in a small space or in an area that's shared by others in our home. If that's you, how's the space working for you? Whatever the constraints for your space, there are tons of changes you can make and heaps of tips that you can deploy to make things work more smoothly. Today's episode is a guide that collates all the awesome ideas from last week's episode with a whole bunch more thrown in as well. We'll cover furniture and storage solutions, organising and orienting your space, managing what comes into your space and the stuff that's already there, and how to develop processes and methods of working that will reduce frustration and increase your sewing enjoyment. Sound good? Then sit tight for a few minutes and we'll get stuck in. Welcome to Check Your Thread, the podcast that will help you sew more sustainably. My name's Zoe and I'm obsessed with sewing. I've been blogging about it for over 16 years and I'm the creator and host of the popular handmade wardrobe challenge Me Made May. But, like many people, I've become increasingly concerned about the climate crisis and I'm looking at the way that my lifestyle contributes to it. So in this podcast, I'll be nerding out about making clothes whilst exploring how to minimise the negative impact that it may have. I really hope you'll join me in this journey. Hello lovely one, how are you doing? Obviously, I can't ignore the horrific result of the US election and the impact that it will have on the entire planet and how much of a setback this is in the fight to mitigate the effects of climate change. Please know for those in the US who will feel the effects more immediately and for everyone else around the world, because we will all be negatively impacted in some form in due course, I'm sending lots of love. Personally, currently, I'm in that interim space between feeling that the wind's been knocked out of me and wanting to hide under a blanket forever, and the bit that must and will come soon. The bit where we dust ourselves off and work out what to do next. I'm starting to get some fight back in me and looking to see how I can broaden and deepen the positive impacts that I'm able to have in the world. I feel a solo episode brewing to address it all directly. Plus, right away, I want to get back into sharing my sustainability wins in the intro of this podcast. Because now, more than ever, we need to hear about the many, many small, easy wins we can have in our everyday lives. So, one sustainability win this week that was a repeat of an action that I took a few months ago. I took out all the clothes my son had recently grown out of or declared he'll never wear for whatever reason, and I bagged them up and I listed them on my local free cycle group. A local guy, funnily enough the same local guy as before, requested the bag of clothes for his son. When he came to collect them, he explained that his son had just had another growth spurt and he was so relieved that they now didn't need to go out and spend a bunch of money that they didn't really have to reclothe him. And karma did its thing because I then received some really good quality snow boots for my son from a friend, just as my son was starting to complain that his wellies were starting to hurt. So I'd like to encourage all of you, if you have kids, make sure you're having semi-regular clear-outs of their outgrown items. They're no use to you clogging up your home. Instead, they could be really helping out another family. And remember, items don't need to be pristine. The items that we just gave away were a real mix. Some of them looked barely touched, but there was others that had like marks or visible signs of laundering repeatedly. But as long as you're honest about what the conditions are, it's all good. And it's always better to get outgrown kids stuff, especially if there are any marks or any kind of flaw, into the hands of a specific family rather than sending them to a charity shop. Because if they're less than pristine, it's really likely that they won't be kept at their highest level of use as an actual garment. And it'll be very likely they either get ragged or sent to the global south or put in landfill or incinerated or something else that we just don't want. If you don't know any families that have children of a suitable age or size to pass them on to, local Buy Nothing groups, Free Cycle or Freegal, or sharing apps like Olio are super easy ways to get the items into the hands of somebody else in your locality that can actually use them. And this isn't only applicable to kids' clothes. Adult clothes that are no longer needed can also be bundled up and offered on these sites as well. Right, so a little podcasting announcement. Check Your Thread is now available to listen to on YouTube. So if you actually prefer to consume audio content on YouTube, as an increasing number of people actually do, just search for Check Your Thread podcast there and you'll find it. There's just a static image and the audio episode just as you can hear it right now. Yeah, and one day I hope to have time to add some other sewing more sustainably content to the channel, maybe some mending tutorials or something, but I'm really far from having the time to do that right now, unfortunately. This week I want to say big thanks to Rhiannon for signing up to support the podcast via Patreon. Thank you so much, Rhiannon. So let's get into today's episode. I really hope that you get some useful takeaways from this one. I really enjoyed making this one. It's collated both the awesome tips from the lovely contributors from last week's episode and a whole bunch of ideas that I've been carrying around in my brain for yonks as well. So in the episode, there is mention of a bunch of products that might be useful for the small or shared space sewer. But sometimes it's tricky talking about an item that might be called something different by somebody else. So I've put a few images in the show notes of products that I've talked about that maybe you weren't sure what I meant. Plus there's links to the other related episodes that were referred to, so you don't have to trawl through the feed if you want to queue up one of those next to listen to after this one. So until next week. Take care of yourself and those who are deserving of your care. Do something to empower yourself and remind yourself of your own agency, and enjoy. So last week we heard from some patrons of the podcast and newsletter subscribers who kindly responded to my request and shared their experiences of small and shared space sewing. I'm super grateful to those who took the time to record a voice note or send me a message for me to read out. I asked the contributors to describe their small or shared space sewing setup. They also told us what they liked about their setup and what worked well, and what they didn't like about it or what frustrated them. And then if they had any suggestions, tips or hacks that might help others working in a similar setup. There were so many awesome suggestions and solutions mentioned, and I thought it might be helpful to make an addendum to that episode that presents all those tips as more of a guide. So if your current sewing space is small or shared with other people and other activities, listen up. Even if it's going well as it is, there might be something in here that you could adopt to make it work even better. And if you're struggling with your sewing space, I really hope that this gives you plenty of ideas for how things could be improved. So I've collated all the tips and takeaways and added some more that I've discovered along the way, and I've put them into 4 categories. There's furniture and equipment, containing and organisation, resources, and methods and processes. Unsurprisingly, all this advice is focused on using or repurposing what you already have, or what can easily be sourced second-hand, or purchased for a pretty small outlay, because we're all about second-hand first and keeping what already exists in use for longer. Plus, we also like to perpetuate the fact that a decent sewing setup doesn't have to cost an arm and a leg, that this hobby is accessible to everyone, not just those with a substantial disposable income. If you want to go to IKEA and buy everything brand new, then you do you, but there aren't any IKEA furniture hacks and the like in this episode. Let's get stuck in with the tips and takeaways related to furniture and equipment. Many of us sew on a dining table, the kitchen table, or maybe a desk that's also used for other activities. Therefore, machinery can't be set up permanently and has to be lifted on and off pretty regularly. If that's you, consider some kind of surface protector for underneath your machine. If you don't already have a table protector, you could make a small, thin quilt type thing for the purpose, or just use an old towel. Protecting the table will mean that you can worry less about damaging the surface. Plus, protector might actually muffle the sound a bit, which might be beneficial if you sew in the same room at the same time as people who are studying or working. If you have a specific table for cutting and or sewing, but your space needs to be multifunctional, putting casters on your table might work well so you can reconfigure the space as you need to. Tables with casters can be positioned where the light is better, or closer to a power socket, for example. And when they're not in use, you can slide them to a less obtrusive part of the room. But of course, they still take up space when not in use. If you need the surface you sew on to effectively disappear when it's not in use, then consider a fold-out table that can then be slid behind a cupboard or under the bed or something when not in use. And tables with a fold-up leaf or that extend in some way can give you extra workspace when necessary and then packed up again to take less space when you're not sewing. A full-sized ironing board can also serve as a decent-sized work surface with the added benefit of being height adjustable. So you can use it as a table in front of the sofa or a chair, or of course you can use it standing up. When I worked as a dressmaker for the charity trade, the sewing machine I used to use was always positioned on the end of the cutting table, so I always sewed standing up. It felt a bit weird at first, but I got used to it. So if there's literally no space to set your machine up on a table, you could try clearing a space on a kitchen countertop and popping your machine on and sewing there. But back to ironing boards and pressing for a sec. If you don't have the space for a full-sized ironing board, there are a number of options that you can use to rest on the table instead. You can get small tabletop ironing boards and pressing mats that are often made of wool, which can sit directly onto a table or the floor. You can even press on an old 100% cotton towel on a heat-resistant surface, such as the kitchen countertop for your pressing. I have one of those sleeve boards, you know, the ones that look like a mini ironing board. And when I'm pressing short seams, or I just want to press a small section of a garment, like the bias binding on a neckline or something, then I just use that resting on a chair or table instead of getting my big ironing board out. So that's tables and ironing board ideas. What furniture do you need to store the rest of your equipment in? So for tools and smaller pieces of equipment, craft trolleys or storage trolleys that usually have like tiers and can be rolled around on casters might be a good option for you and your space. They keep everything together, and because they're open, it's all super accessible. I've seen them for between £20 and £35 new, and it could be a really good investment. But you might be able to source something suitable secondhand, a former drinks trolley perhaps, something you can wheel over when you're ready to work on your project and then be tucked out of the way somewhere when you're not sewing. Obviously, existing bookcases, cupboards, cabinets, shelves and shelving units can be utilised to store all your tools and smaller sewing equipment, as well as machinery when not in use, plus sewing patterns and possibly your fabric as well. In previous episodes, I've been a proponent of keeping all your patterns together and all your fabric together in one place, if at all possible, which of course it isn't for everyone. But if you can, it has the benefit of helping you keep on top of what you own, so you don't forget about or lose items that you might then end up purchasing again unnecessarily. Keeping like with like in this way also makes your project planning smoother and less frustrating, because you can compare suitable options far more easily when they're side by side, rather than with one piece in your bedroom and the other in the shed, for example. But as for the storage furniture itself, let's all collectively let go of the idea of the stereotypical white IKEA craft room setup. If you have it, that's great, but it's not the only way a well-functioning craft space can look. There really is so much possibility and potential to be found, not to mention financial savings to be made, in furniture that you already own or what you might find in the thrift store or on Facebook Marketplace. Usually, using bookshelves, cupboards, shelving and such for sewing equipment and supplies will require you to obtain storage containers of some type or other as well. Your machines and possibly your folded fabric could sit right on the shelves, but tools, equipment and notions will need containing in some way, unless your storage furniture also includes a number of drawers. We'll get into the topic of storage containers and organisations more in a tick, but what you choose to go for in terms of containers will probably be impacted to a great degree by the type of storage furniture you're working with. So if you're in the process of selecting storage furniture and you have some options available to you, consider if you want to go for something with opaque doors that can automatically hide any mess or conceal ugly containers, or are you going for open shelving or a glass-fronted cabinet or something? So if you're going for something open and your sewing items are going to be on permanent display, you're going to need to give your items for storage some additional thought. Alternatively, if you have an open-fronted situation, you could make a blind or curtain to conceal the contents. That would also have the added benefit of protecting your items from dust and sunlight. So, as we just mentioned, linked to your furniture and equipment setup is containing and organisation. So as I say, machinery and fabric could potentially just sit on shelves or in a cupboard, but tools, smaller pieces of equipment, patterns and haberdashery all require containment. As I see it, there are 3 considerations when it comes to storage container options: aesthetics, accessibility and ease of function. So you need to have a think about what your needs are related to these. Aesthetics might be more of a priority if you have to store your machinery, supplies and equipment in full view in a shared space. If your machines are permanently set up in a shared space, consider making some covers in fabric that suits the decor of the room that you sew in. You could even use some of the same fabric to cover your ironing board possibly. Plus, some other ideas of storage you could make include fabric baskets for catching thread and scraps or containing tools, or you could make a hanging storage with pockets that go on a wall or the back of a door. I said before that fabric could potentially be folded and put on a shelf, but if that doesn't work for your space, or you want it more contained and protected, there are heaps of things that you can repurpose for the job. There's no need to go to the container store and get some big plastic tubs. For storing your fabric, what about using wicker baskets or bedroom boxes or wooden trunks or vintage suitcases or wine crates or picnic baskets or laundry baskets? Now, as for containing tools, equipment and haberdashery, there is so much fun to be had by seeing what you can find that might fit the bill. As I say, whether or not the items will be permanently visible or not might influence this. You could use sweet tins or biscuit tins, cookie jars, plant pots, drawers and desk tidies designed for stationery and office supplies, spice racks, shoe boxes, hat boxes, pencil or makeup cases, glass jars, bowls, sturdy boxes you received gifts in, magazine files, document files, kitchen utensil holders. The options are limitless. And when you're having to shoehorn your sewing stuff into a small space, think about how you can make the most of vertical space. I mentioned hanging organisers, the types with pockets that can be hung on a wall or the back of the door. You can usually find them for sale, often intended for storing shoes, but they'd also be really easy to make yourself. Pegboards that go on the wall are super popular with crafters because they allow you to hang items like scissors and stuff off them, which keeps your space looking really organised and your equipment is really accessible. There are also pegboards designed specifically for organising and storing thread reels and overlocker thread cones. Some get attached to a wall and there's others that are freestanding. You can find thread pegboards and stands in most big craft stores, but UK residents, remember we heard about Cornwall-based small business thread pegs from Bevan from Bourne Textiles. Thread pegs make lovely thread reel, overlocker cone and bobbin peg storage boards, and I want them so much. If you're handy with a saw though, maybe you'd like to try making either a general wall pegboard or a thread pegboard yourself. Cork pin boards or magnetic notice boards also make the most of wall space. They can be used for lighter weight items like paper pattern pieces, instruction booklets or inspo pics that you don't want to lose. And hanging things is such a great way to maximise a small space. We just mentioned pegboards, but also you can hang a ton of sewing related stuff from hooks. So think about where you could screw in or hammer in some hooks. Hooks can go on walls, the back of doors, underneath shelves, the inside of cupboard doors, the underside of a table or desktop, on a curtain pole or rail. So many locations for hooks. I've also seen these metal baskets that are called undershelf baskets, and you can slide them onto a shelf or the table or a desktop. And they give you a useful compartment that makes the most of potentially wasted space underneath your surface. I'm not sure exactly what they were originally designed for, but I saw them being used in a tiny kitchen on some interior design program recently. You could probably get them in different sizes, but some look just the right size for all the cut-out pieces of a garment project. But let's talk about organisation relating to accessibility and ease of function. So think about how you might be able to reconfigure your space or setup so it works better for your needs. If you feel stuck in a certain setup because of the lighting or power socket location, could you access additional lighting or an extension lead or multi-way socket? If you struggle to access a socket, there are smart plugs available that you can switch on and off using an app on your phone. So, for example, you could leave your iron plugged in without having to bend down to switch it on and off. So with additional lighting and more accessible or extended power for your machines, you might have more options for where in the room or in your home that you can sew. Or if it's too cold in your spot at certain times of the year, could you get an inexpensive space heater to make it more pleasant? There are lots of cheaper, energy-efficient ones available. As someone who feels the cold basically all year round, I know how grim and off-putting the thought of sewing in a chilly room is. Okay, now this tip might sound silly, but it has honestly upped to my sewing-related happiness considerably. So I asked for some noise-cancelling headphones for my last birthday. As a result, I am now far happier sewing in our shared space. So when my husband or kids are playing a noisy computer game or watching a loud TV programme, the headphones mean I can whack on a podcast and have a blissful time only metres away from them. So regarding physical accessibility and ease of function for the dining or kitchen table sewers among us, if the thought of getting your machines and equipment and bits and bobs out is putting you off from doing some sewing, let's think how you can make things easier for yourself. For maximum ease, obviously you need to keep your machine as nearby as possible to the surface you use it on. If you don't want to literally leave it on the floor under the table or behind your chair, is there a cupboard or dresser or something in the room that you could clear out one section of and store your machine in there, so it's hidden but very near? As for the tools and equipment that you need regularly, can you keep those together in one bag or tub or basket that you can just grab from close by and plop on the table? And then keep all the pattern pieces and notions related to one project together in a box or a basket or a crate. Think about how you can collate items to make setting up and packing away take less than a couple of minutes. This is obviously linked to methods and processes, and we'll get there shortly. But first, let's think about our resources. By this, I mean the stuff we buy for a new project, the fabric, the patterns, the notions, but also the equipment and even the machinery that we might accumulate. I think we really need to address the stuff itself, as well as how we're containing, storing and organising it, like we've been talking about so far. So, what I need to say now is probably super obvious, but I have to say it. We have to carefully consider each item that we're thinking about purchasing and bringing into our homes. It's so basic, but it needs to be said. The more you buy, the more stuff you will have. From a sustainability standpoint and also from a financial standpoint, we should be considering each purchase carefully anyway. But if your sewing space is small or you lack storage, then it's all the more reason to be vigilant about purchases and about accepting donations. When it comes to the items we buy for a specific project, the fabric, the patterns, the notions, you just need to deploy one incredibly simple tactic. And it's this: keep the items at the shop until you're actually about to use them. And by keeping them at the shop, I mean don't buy them until they're required. So this is something that I was banging on about previously in episode 145, 5 simple tactics to save on sewing. But it totally needs to be shouted about in regards to saving space also. Only buy the stuff you need for the project you're about to make next. You don't need to purchase all the fabrics, patterns and all the notions for every project you've had an idea for, or that you speculate you might like to make in the future. Obs, this will save you money because if your plans change, you won't be left with stuff you're not going to use. But also, the items won't be sitting on your shelves or your sewing table, taking up valuable space in the meantime. As for tools, equipment and other resources that don't get used up as such, I have 2 points. So, my first point is to think about what you already have versus what you actually use. I know for sure that I'm currently storing some tools and haberdashery that I was given that I haven't used and probably won't ever use. So let's be honest about that. And consider the items you own that do the same job. Do you need doubles or triples or more of everything? Do you need multiple pairs of fabric scissors? Or have you somehow ended up with 3 rotary cutters? You obviously have a favourite, so keep your fave, maybe select a backup and then pass the rest on. You could give the rest away on FreeCycle or to a sewing school or something, or you could try selling them if they're in good condition. Let's have an honest sort out because freeing up some of your precious space will be so worth the effort. So the second point is this: you don't need to own everything and you also don't need to have access to everything all the time. So I know that this is like the antithesis of how marketing has encouraged us to think about our possessions since the 1930s, but it's true. You don't need to own everything yourself, and you don't need constant access to everything you might ever want to use. Sometimes you can borrow stuff that then doesn't need to be found a permanent home for. An obvious crafting example is sewing and knitting books and magazines. Could they be borrowed from a local library or from a sewing friend? So if you are lucky enough to have in real life sewing friends, what if you got even more resourceful and organised and shared more stuff with them? Not everyone needs to own every piece of equipment or machinery. Do you remember Sarah I spoke to in 133 for the Mending in Public Day episode? Sarah told us that she and her pals share a jewellery cleaning kit. They realised that neither needed to own a jewellery cleaning kit permanently, so they worked out a system to share one. What else could that mindset extend to? What if you lent out your overlocker to your friend for a while and you got to use their cover stitch machine from time to time? With a bit of planning and communication, sharing can happen and therefore space and money can be saved. So a side note related to resources, interestingly, a number of the contributors we heard from in last week's episode talked about actively trying to reduce their fabric stashes and resource collections. You heard it mentioned in last week's episode a bit, But it was discussed even more in their longer communications with me that didn't end up in the final episode. They talked about wanting to reduce their fabric stash for a number of reasons, including making a smaller sewing space function better. I actually want to address this topic of reducing a fabric stash in another mini-series in the near future. So bear with me and we'll explore that and share some tips in the coming weeks. Right, so finally, methods and processes. We've already addressed how furniture, storage and organisation can improve your processes and make your sewing life easier. From adjusting and adapting and repositioning things, to using containers to collate items so you can get going and pack up again in a flash. But this can be taken even further. Many of us who sew in a shared space, but obviously not all, we're doing so because we live with other people, for some including children. But all of us, partnered or not, parents or not, play many roles in our lives, and time spent sewing can also be easily deprioritised. If this resonates and you find that your sewing is consistently falling to the bottom of the things to do list, the How to Prioritise Sewing with Jenny Drew, which is episode 101, is really worth a listen. This overlaps a lot with the Sewing versus Kids episode, which was episode 11. So if you're a parent or carer of some sort, then please make sure you listen to that one too. Those episodes are largely about mindset and habit formation, but we also have to make it as easy as possible for ourselves to get going by not wasting precious time searching and gathering. So please do take heed of those ideas of collating tools and equipment and all the things you need for one specific project. So then you can just grab them and get going. I loved the suggestion also of using a corkboard to keep your pattern instructions and all your pattern pieces together, so that there's less time spent searching for that one critical missing pattern piece. And the idea of using a whiteboard or some other note-taking setup to remind yourself where you got to and what you need to do next. That's really going to give future you a big help when you find your next few minutes to sew. Another tip that might help you avoid frustration is working out in advance a good spot in your project to stop before you need to pack away. Then, rather than thinking, damn it, I need to pack up for dinner now, it could be reframed to, cool, I got to the point where I wanted to stop at, sweet. But when time is limited, try to adjust your expectations to pushing forward just one process or one seam at a time. That is the most impactful mindset shift you can make. As Catherine noted, it's amazing how much you can do in 6 minutes, and lots of 6-minute sessions really do add up. And working on one project at a time is really beneficial for the small or shared space sewer. That's fewer items to keep track of and fewer distractions for your brain. So I really hope that you find something in all of this that is helpful for you. And if you have some tips or solutions that you feel were missed from this episode, and I'm sure there are many, please share them with me so I can make a follow-up. So you can email me zoe@checkyourthread.com, or you can find me on Instagram @checkyourthread. So I just want to add a conclusion to this. So I guess I came into making these episodes with a slight inferiority complex about sewing in a small and shared space, as opposed to having a dedicated sewing room. Even though I fully acknowledge that I probably do more sewing because it is in our shared space rather than in a separate room, I think I was probably coming at this topic thinking small and shared sewing spaces are less than ideal. So I kind of pictured the topic through the lens of, let's get some tips so we can make the best of our limitations. But listening to these contributions from these awesome makers, there are definitely more benefits to this than I previously considered. So by making these 2 episodes, my view has shifted, and personally, I'm now actually a full convert to small and shared space sewing. Of course, all sewing spaces are good sewing spaces, but there are some strong pluses to small and shared space sewing. Sewing in a small space helps you keep on top of what you're working on and encourages you to be more organised. And if you are able to work in a small space, you have more flexibility to choose where in the home it might be best located. You might be able to choose its location based on the best light, how warm or cool the space is, and where there's sufficient power points. Small and shared space sewing absolutely encourages us to be more mindful of our consumption of sewing materials and resources. How many machines do you need? How much fabric can you fit on your shelves? If you have a small space for your sewing stuff, you have to be more selective about each item entering your space. And if you're spending less time and brain space on acquiring more resources, you have more time and brain space for planning and making your projects. And sewing in a shared space allows you to maximise the time you spend with a partner and or family without neglecting your creativity. This probably results in you getting more sewing done than if you had a dedicated sewing room, because it means you can integrate it with the rest of your life more easily. So there we go. If you sew in a small or shared space, I hope you're feeling pretty good about it and you picked up some ideas for how it could be made to work even better. Thanks again, everyone who contributed, and to you for listening. Thanks so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and are left feeling inspired. For more info about the podcast, including show notes for this and every episode, head to checkyourthread.com. I'd love to hear from you, so if you have any comments, questions or ideas for future episodes, please get in touch by emailing zoe@checkyourthread.com or find me on Instagram @checkyourthread. Massive thanks to Patrick Potter for production support, to Sylvia Seller for the awesome logo design, and to Simon at Palm Skin Productions for the music. This ad-free podcast would not be possible without listener support, so if you feel you are able, please consider signing up to the Check Your Thread Patreon. For the equivalent of buying me a coffee each month, you'll be making it possible to continue producing regular episodes. Links can be found in the show notes and on the website checkyourthread.com. I hope you'll listen again next week. Until then, take care. Bye!